Amen. 2 Samuel chapter 16. 2 Samuel chapter 16. Second Samuel chapter 16. We'll be looking in a few verses in just a minute. It all started so innocently over potato salad. As anyone from a country church can tell you, family recipes are guarded like Fort Knox. Beware of that woman that just clapped right over there. Many techniques, many ingredients are passed down through generations, and they're considered classified. On deathbeds throughout the South, grandmothers who are preparing to meet Jesus whisper secret spices and combinations to their descendants. And these recipes often make their way to church fellowship dinners and dinner on the ground and friend days and homecomings. And it's on these days that competing bowls of potato salad and platters of fried chicken, mounds of banana pudding, they stand side by side. And woe to the unsuspecting pastor who chooses one potato salad over another one. He better get ready to send out his resume quickly, as he has deeply injured one family and given bragging rights to the other. Well, this is what actually happened to a new pastor at Mount Moriah Baptist Church in North Carolina. On a particular Sunday, the church was to share in a meal following the morning service. The brand new pastor, not aware of the circumstances, said the blessing before the meal and then bragged about how all the tables were filled with such great food. Being the new preacher, he was then invited, along with his family, to go first in line and fill up his plate. Little did he know that this moment was more serious than a criminal background check. Every woman was eyeing the preacher as he slowly made his way toward the deviled eggs. While each of the 8 varieties seemed on the surface to be exactly alike, this was deceptive. Because beneath the thin layer of paprika lay 8 different family recipes. He finally took a couple of deviled eggs off of one plate and walked forward. The women all glanced at the woman who had made those chosen eggs. She just smiled, almost smugly, knowing that all eyes were on her. Still, however, he had not come to the testing table. The testing table contained 6 different types of potato salad. The preacher, without thinking, just grabbed the first bowl he came to with the serving spoon in it. As all the women looked on, they watched as the pastor unwittingly chose the potato salad made by the exact same woman who made the deviled eggs. Now the fight was on. Accusations began to fly. Some charged the woman with moving the serving spoon to her bowl so the preacher would have to pick hers first. Others accused her of stealing another woman's recipe, while others even whispered that she had tipped off the pastor, telling him to pick her dish, which was seen as favoritism. So by the time the meal was over and the women were carrying their casserole dishes with their names written in nail polish on the bottom of them, people were taking sides. Bitterness had taken root. And within 3 years, this new pastor would be voted out. Sounds absolutely ridiculous, doesn't it? But petty things like this can happen anywhere if we as believers harbor unforgiveness. If I could say anything to our graduates today, it would be this. One of the greatest Christian attributes you can attain is a forgiving spirit. But this attribute also happens to be the most difficult to acquire. Someone said it this way: most of us would rather sit on a judgment seat rather than a mercy seat. If somebody does us wrong, we'd rather watch them squirm in misery than smile in relief. Yet understand, forgiveness isn't just about the other person. It's about you too. See, when we're unforgiving, it has a dramatic downward effect on our life, and it's usually played out in 5 ways that come one right after the other. The first is an offense. You are offended about something, and if there isn't forgiveness after that offense, then resentment begins to build. And if there isn't forgiveness following resentment, then hatred comes in to take its place. Continued hatred leads to a grudge. And then grudge ultimately settles into revenge. I'm just biding my time. When I have my chance, I will get back at you. Understand, every week, every one of us has to come to terms with not letting some offense linger and leading us back into resentment. I have to deal with it. You have to deal with it. And as we'll see this morning, a man after God's own heart has to deal with it. This morning, I want us to look at forgiveness in the life of King David. And here in this chapter, 2 Samuel 16, it's a great place to start because at this point in David's life, he is lower than he's ever been. His life has been turned upside down, and we find him very depressed and so very low. David had sinned with Bathsheba, and that set off a whole chain of events. Nathan said to him, David, your baby's going to die, and that happened. He said, David, your wives will be taken advantage of in public, and that happened. He said, David, your family will turn against you, and that too has happened. His own son, Absalom, has conspired against him, has stolen the throne, and now he's reigning as king, and David is on the run. And it's here that David is at his lowest. Most believe it's at this moment that David wrote Psalm 40, where he said, I waited patiently for the Lord, and he inclined to me and heard my cry. He brought me up out of a horrible pit, out of the miry clay, and he set my feet upon a rock and established my goings. But verse 12 of that chapter says this, for innumerable evils have surrounded me. My iniquities have overtaken me so that I'm not able to even look up. They're more numerous than the hairs of my head, and my heart has failed me. You ever felt that way before? That everywhere you turn, evil's surrounding you. Pressure's in on all sides. You feel like you're in a pit and you can't seem to get out. That's where David is in this chapter. And it's in this desperate moment, with fear and with guilt crushing in on top of David, that out of nowhere comes a man by the name of Shimei. And he comes just to add to David's misery. You ever had that happen to you? Things are going bad, you feel bad, and then somebody comes in and kicks you in the side. You might say, who is Shimei? One writer said this. He said, to put it bluntly, he's a jerk. Alexander White calls him a reptile from the royal house of Saul. So if you have your Bibles, I want you to look in 2 Samuel 16, and let's read about this man, Shimei. Verse 5 says, and when King David came to Bahurim, behold, thence came out a man of the family of the house of Saul, whose name was Shimei, the son of Gera. He came forth and cursed still as he came. And he cast stones at David, and all his servants of King David, and all the people, and all the mighty men were on his right and on his left. And thus said Shimei when he cursed, come out, thou bloody man, thou man of Belial. The Lord hath returned upon thee all the blood of the house of Saul, in whose stead thou hast reigned. And the Lord hath delivered the kingdom into the hand of Absalom thy son. And behold, thou art taken in thy mischief, because thou art a bloody man. Did you get what he's accusing David of here? Yeah. Get out of here, you murderer. The Lord is paying you back for murdering King Saul and his family. Did David do that? That was a lie. Then he says this, not only that, you stole King Saul's throne. That was another lie. God took the throne from King Saul. David never stole it. And then he said this, and the Lord has given your kingdom to Absalom. That's a third lie. The Lord never gave anything. Absalom stole it. So here's Shimei. He's the kind of person who kicks you while you're down. You're at the very lowest pit, and along comes this guy to throw dirt on top of you. And it's at these times that if you're going through these things, it's always great to have a good friend to come up alongside of you and give you good, godly counsel. Aren't you thankful for good friends who give you godly counsel? Unfortunately, David didn't have that. In verse 9 it says, Then it said Abishai, the son of Zeruiah, unto the king, Why should this dead dog curse my lord the king? Let me go over and take off his head. How you like that for godly counsel? Let me at him. I'll slice his throat so fast he won't know till he sneezes. I want you to know something. You will always have somebody saying stuff like this. You're going through a trial, you will always have people coming up to you saying things that you ought to do in the flesh. They haven't prayed about it. They haven't gone to God for you. It's just in the flesh. So I say this to you this morning. Be careful, church, who's giving you godly counsel. They could make things much more worse if you listen to them. Abishai says, Hey, David, you don't have to take that. Stand up for yourself. Don't let him walk all over you. In fact, let me at him. I'll take care of it. So David now has a choice. He can be offended. He can become resentful. He can take revenge. It says in verse 10, talking to Abishai, and the king said, What have I to do with you, ye sons of Zeruiah? If you remember when your parents would get really upset with you and they'd call you by your first and middle name. Maybe ever had that happen to them? Your first and middle name. That's what David's doing right here. He's not calling him by his first and middle name, but he calls him, You son of Zeruiah. And David's going to use this term around 7 or 8 times in the Old Testament. And what we know about these sons of Zeruiah is this. They were built with a short fuse. Every one of them carried a chip on their shoulder. If there's a problem, you know how they solve it? Let's fight. If there's a problem, I don't want a solution. I don't want to talk it through. I don't want to try to compromise. I want to fight you. So anytime you hear David using that term, understand, it's never a compliment. So Abishai's solution, Hey, David, let's kill this guy. Let me take off his head. So what's David going to do? He has a decision to make. I mean, he is the king. And here's a guy who's lying about him, disrespecting him, throwing rocks at him. How would you respond if that was happening to you? I probably would have said, Abishai, have at it, buddy. But I want you to listen to what King David says. What wisdom here. In verse 10, he says, What have I to do with you, ye sons of Zeruiah? So let him curse. Because the Lord hath said unto him, Curse David. Who shall then say, Wherefore hast thou done so? Look at verse 12. It may be that the Lord will look on my affliction and that the Lord will requite me good for his cursing this day. Do you see what David's saying? Yeah. He's saying, if the Lord has told him to curse me, then let him curse me. Who are we to stop him? But if the Lord hasn't told him to curse me, maybe God will look upon my affliction and he'll bless me because this guy's cursing me. And I read that and I say, I don't know if I could do that. Could you? David's at rock bottom. Along comes Shimei throwing stones. But instead of fighting back, David says, Hey, listen, don't worry about it. The Lord's in control of this. The Lord's got this covered. He never got offended. He never took it personally. He doesn't even seem to yell or raise his voice. So I asked the question, David, how'd you do it? I'll tell you how he did it. David learned a very important lesson that I want every one of our seniors that may be going into leadership or going into the ministry, I want you to learn real quick. David learned that as a leader, you better have 2 qualities. Number 1, you better have a tender heart. Number 2, you better have a tough hide. A tender heart and a tough hide. If you hope to be used of God, you better get some thick skin real quick, because you can count on it. You will be blamed for things you didn't do. You're going to be criticized for things you're trying to do. You'll get misquoted. You'll get misunderstood. Besides all that, hey, welcome to the ministry. Any of you ever remember that comic strip, The Far Side? Remember that? It was done by Gary Larson. He put humor into 4-footed animals. I saw one that went perfectly with this. It was one of this deer, and it was a huge deer, and his name was Ralph, and Ralph had a big set of antlers. But unfortunately, on Ralph's side, he had a bullseye right on the sweet spot of his side. So he has these huge antlers up on this hill, and he has this bullseye on his side, and down below is this smaller deer, and he's looking up at Ralph, and here's the caption. It said this, "Hey, Ralph, that's a bummer of a birthmark." Sometimes in the ministry, you'll feel like there's a bullseye right on the sweet spot. There are Shimeis out there by the dozen ready to hurl stones at you. But listen, the people who get the job done are those who are able to overlook all sorts of hurtful little comments that others are going to make. Why do you think Moses spent 40 years in the wilderness watching dumb sheep? God was preparing him for the next 40 years in the wilderness when he'd be watching dumb people. And if you're called into leadership or any part of ministry where you must deal with people, as W.A. Criswell said, you must be well shod and armor plated. That simply means this: you have to have a protective coating against the slings and the stones of people like Shimei. And I got news for you. If you haven't run into a Shimei, just wait. It's only a matter of time. Old Junior Hill, I love Junior Hills. He preaches, and he pastored 3 churches before God called him into full-time evangelism. He said, the first church I went to, he said, I'd go and I'd prepare and I'd sit behind that pulpit and I'd start to preach, and there was the meanest, ugliest woman sitting on the front row, just crossing her arms, looking at me real mean. He said every single Sunday morning she was there on the front row just looking mean and crossing her arms. And he said after about 4 months of this, I prayed, Lord, would you send a pulpit committee and get me out of this place? He said, you never believe what God did. He got me out of this place. He said, I moved across town to a nice, beautiful, big church on the other side. And he said, wouldn't you know it, my first Sunday in the new church, sitting on the front row must have been her twin sister. He said, 10 years later, I went to my third church and found out there were triplets. It's only a matter of time when Shimei shows up to try and hinder the work of the Lord. So you got a decision to make. Am I going to get easily offended? Am I big enough to forgive? Or will I reduce myself to his size and start throwing back stones? David chose to let the Lord be judge. And he moves on away from this man named Shimei, and he's a better man for doing it. So let's jump ahead in the story. I want you to turn to 2 Samuel 19 to see how all this plays out. In 2 Samuel chapter 19, we find some time has passed. We know that Absalom has been brutally murdered. His hair has been caught in a tree. Joab sees him and comes and kills him. So Absalom's been removed from the throne, and the people of Israel, they're starting to rejoice and starting to turn back to David as their leader. He's come from the lowest valley back up to the highest mountaintop. Things are going great. It couldn't be better. And wouldn't you know it, once again, who do you think shows up? That old reptile, Shimei. He comes slithering into Jerusalem. But I want you to notice he's singing a different tune this time. Chapter 19, verse 16, it says, and Shimei, the son of Gera, a Benjamite, which is of Baharim, notice, hasted and came down with the men of Judah to meet King David. He's in a hurry. And there were 1,000 men of Benjamin with him, and Ziba, the servant of the house of Saul, and his 15 sons, and his 20 servants with him. And they went over to Jordan before the king, and there went over a ferry boat to carry over the king's household and do what he thought good. And Shimei, the son of Gera, fell down before the king as he came over Jordan, and said unto the king, let not my lord impute iniquity unto me, neither do thou remember that which thy servant did. Hey, forget what I said. Notice at the end of that verse that the king should take it to heart. Hey, king, don't take it to heart what I said. He says this, for thy servant doth know that I have sinned. Therefore, behold, I am come this first day of the house of Joseph to go down and meet my lord the king. You talk about a total 180. This guy, it didn't even sound like the same guy. He was cursing him and throwing rocks at one time. Now in chapter 19, he says the hardest 3 words in the English language. I have sinned. And I wonder if those words didn't ring a bell in David's mind. Because it hadn't been too many years ago that he had said those exact same words to the prophet Nathan when he had sinned with Bathsheba. He said, I have sinned. Church, I want you to understand that forgiveness comes a whole lot easier when we remember times in our own past when we failed and we needed forgiveness. It's what Paul had in mind when Paul said, and be ye kind one to another, tenderhearted, forgiving one another, even as God for Christ's sake hath forgiven you. So here's Shimei, spread out on the ground before David, and he's saying, I have sinned. And what he's really saying is this, will you please forgive me? And wouldn't you know it, in steps Abishai with some more great, heartfelt, godly counsel. Verse 21, but Abishai the son of Zeruiah answered and said, shall not Shimei be put to death for this? Because he cursed the Lord's anointed. David, he kicked you when you were down, so kick him back and finish him off. Here's your chance. I'll give you one guess what David calls Abishai. Verse 22, what have I to do with you, ye sons of Zeruiah, that ye should this day be an adversary to me? I mean, it's my coronation day. I'm back in the kingdom. Can I enjoy just one day? Verse 23, therefore the king said to Shimei, thou shalt not die. And the king sware unto him. Here's what I love about David right here. He isn't swayed by Abishai's counsel any more than he was swayed by Shimei's insults. He handles both of them at the two ends of the spectrum, handles both of them with grace and mercy. Why? Because the humbled forgiven make good forgivers. Do you hear that? The humbled forgiven make good forgivers. David knew only too well what it meant to be a sinner. He knew only too well the heartache of having done someone else wrong. He knew what it meant to receive forgiveness from the Lord and the relief and the burden that's lifted following repentance and forgiveness. Church, being well aware of our own shortcomings will give us patience with others when they do us wrong. The humbled forgiven make good forgivers. But then there's the other side. Then there's the proud. But the proud, they have a hard time forgiving. Those who never look in the mirror and see their own failures, they have a tough time tolerating and forgiving the failures of others. So I close with this. If we are to develop a spirit of forgiveness in our own lives, if we are to put forgiveness into action, we must do 3 things. I'm going to give them to you very quickly. Number 1, we must try to understand where the offender is coming from. We must try to understand where the offender is coming from. And this is hard to do. But we need to try to see beyond the offense and find that little boy inside that man who's lashing out at you with his ungodly behavior. We need to try to find that little girl inside of that woman who's striking back at you with offensive words. Because what comes out up here, if it's ungodly, guess where it starts? Right here. There's an obviously deep heart issue taking place. We want to see if we can find the true source of why they're acting this way. Who knows? Maybe David saw a touch of his old self in Shimei as those rocks came flying by his head. There's usually something deeper than the hurtful words coming from their lips. Maybe they're just having a bad day, or a bad week, or a bad month. or a bad year. You know it. A guy gets yelled at work. He comes home and screams at his wife. She becomes angry and yells at the kids. The kids become angry, kick the dog. The dog goes out and bites someone. Just becomes a chain reaction if we're not careful. But putting ourselves in another person's shoes often helps us to objectively look at their reactions. By the way, Jesus did this while he was hanging on the cross. He looked at his own accusers. Remember what he prayed? Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do. So number one, try to understand where the offender is coming from. Number two, we must do this. Number two, we need to recall times in our own life when we needed forgiveness. Recall times in our own life when we needed forgiveness. Because all of us at one time or another have said something dumb. All of us at one time have said something offensive, and we've needed someone else's forgiveness. And it may be with our friends or family, it may be at work, it may be at school. Lord help it, it may even be at our church. Nobody is above anyone else. We've all been there. So we say, Lord, help me to apply forgiveness when needed, because I've needed your forgiveness from others in my life. And then there's a third thing we must do. And it's this: we need to verbalize our forgiveness. Hear what I said? We need to verbalize our forgiveness. Say it. Don't just think it. Oh, but they already know I'm sorry. I don't need to say anything. No. Stuart Briscoe said this: spoken words of forgiveness are marvelously therapeutic to the offender, no matter how small or how great the offense may have been. You know what our typical response usually is to an offense? The silent treatment, or resentment, or a grudge, which all three end up leading to revenge. And how many know none of that pleases God? Neither does it work, it makes it worse. So Lord, give us a heart like David. Give us a heart full of forgiveness and mercy and grace in our families, at our work, with our friends, and certainly in our church. Close with this story. John D. Rockefeller was the man who built the great Standard Oil Company. He was a man who demanded high performance from all his executives. And one day, one of those executives made a $2 million mistake. Word of the man's enormous error quickly spread throughout the executive offices, and the other men began to make themselves scarce. Afraid of Rockefeller's reaction, they didn't want to cross his path. However, there was one man, he didn't have a choice because he had scheduled an appointment with his boss for that afternoon. So he straightened his shoulders and he walked into Rockefeller's office. As he approached his boss's desk, he noticed Rockefeller looked up from a piece of paper on which he had been writing. Rockefeller said, I guess you've heard about the $2 million mistake our friend made this morning. The executive quickly answered, Yeah, I can't believe that. Just waiting for any moment for Rockefeller to explode. They said Rockefeller looked at him and said, You know what? I've been sitting here listing all of our friends' good qualities on this sheet of paper. And I've discovered that in the past, he's made us many more times the amount he lost for us today by his one mistake. His good points far outweigh his one human error, so I think we ought to forgive him today, don't you? That man said, I about lost my lunch. And they forgave the man. And I thought, whether it's a $2 million mistake or some harsh words, some criticism, somebody throwing stones at you, let's respond as David did. Being aware of our own failures, being aware of our own need of forgiveness. Since Christ can forgive me of my sin, then I can forgive them of theirs. Amen? Heads bowed and eyes closed.